Thank you very much for tuning in tonight. My son has actually showed up on this call. He is Peter Bradley, and I want to credit him with the idea for this, actually. He told me about this idea, shifting baselines, about 6 weeks ago, maybe longer ago. And it seemed to me that I would really enjoy the opportunity to think myself about some memories I have of things in nature that used to be that aren't anymore. Memories that are valuable to me, that sort of anchor me a little bit. And maybe I'd love to hear those stories from other people as well. So I wanted to say just a little bit about this idea of shifting baselines. We all know, we've been taught, we've heard, we've read about losses in biodiversity, in declining populations of insects and birds and fish, habitat loss globally. There was a big report out of the UN last year from the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So we know all this. We also know that these trends have been going on in North America, at least a few hundred years. More slowly, perhaps, but they have been going on. And that generations before us experienced nature somewhat differently than we do, or than we have. And so there is this idea that with each succeeding generation, there tends to be a loss of memory of what nature can be, a kind of amnesia. And so what I'd like to do tonight is think of our memories, share our memories, and somehow expand our sense of what is possible in nature, just thinking about what we've already known in the past. Think about expand our sense of what's possible in nature, what the potential might be, and to increase our ability to recognize something that is degraded, because we have a sense of how it once was. So that's what tonight is about. It's about these personal memories and how valuable they are. So a few of us will start. Joan and Moira and Deborah volunteered to early on to relate some story. And so we'll start. I'll go first. And so I live on a busy county road near Castleman. And we moved there in 1991. And at that time, there was a barn next door, and there was a barn across the road, and there were bats that flew around at twilight at night in the summer, and lots of insects. And we had swallows. We had lines of swallows, dozens at a time, on the telephone lines going along the road. And there's always this chattering going on summer days. And then at some point, I wasn't really paying attention or writing this down, but I think maybe between 2000 and 2005, the barn next door burned down. The barn across the road got demolished. It was an old wooden barn. And the bats disappeared, and there were fewer and fewer swallows on the lines, so that it's years, many years now since I've seen lines of swallows, dozens of swallows on the lines in front of the house. And that's still the case. There were years when we didn't see any swallows in the backyard. Then a neighbor got a bird box for the backyard, and some swallows came. So we do have some tree swallows now. That's it. So next, Moira, would you like to tell your story now? Moira, I'm going to try to ask you to unmute.
Hi.
Hi.
You can hear me?
Welcome. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'll just read my memory, which came up, when you sent around your initial message. This is what came to mind. So when I was 4 or 5 years old, I woke up very early one morning, long before my parents, and padded out to the living room in my pajamas. This was in deep winter, mid-1960s, in a new suburb of Barrie, Ontario. And what I remember was just how much snow there was back then. Often so much, we had to get neighbors to shovel out the front and, well, both doors to our house because the drifts had settled against our doors. And as I said, this was a new suburb, lots of bungalows and, new development. And pine trees property, and we called them all Christmas trees. And I looked out the living room window, the snowy landscape, and saw us sitting on top of one of the trees. And I went to my parents' bedroom and announced, "There's an owl on my Christmas tree." I call them all my trees. So my parents were not inclined to get up at the crack of dawn. I think they thought I was making it up. As I remember, one of my gifts that year at Christmas had been a book that was called "There's an Elephant in My Bathtub." And so we had been joking for a while. There's a fox in my kitchen. There's an ostrich in my bed. Really, there is an owl out there. And after Dad probably muttering, "Oh yeah, sure, okay." Promptly did a double take and called and snapping some pictures, which we still, I'm afraid, I couldn't find it. It's packed away somewhere, of what I now know was a barn on top of this. On that sense of love of nature in my childhood in Barrie, Ontario, and on very snowy days. Thank you.
Thank you, Moira. I missed some of that. I don't know whether it's my connection or yours, in case anybody else missed part of it. I don't know, the punchline for me was that in their new suburban house, there was a barred owl sitting on a little conifer tree out in their backyard. Thank you. Okay, Joan. Joan, would you like to tell your story?
Yeah, do you want to my face up? Well, we have a cottage. It's a family cottage that my parents built 65 years ago. So so I remember lots of things from my youth, but of course I wasn't watching things as closely as I'm watching now. And but I do remember paddling around the lake and looking for tadpoles. It was interesting. Someone else had mentioned tadpoles, that they'd seen them. But I remember seeing masses of tadpoles and seeing them at different stages of development on their way to being frogs. So, and bullfrogs. I remember seeing bullfrogs, and we don't see those now, which is quite sad. In fact, we used to, when we were little kids, we used to build frog pits And in the middle of the night, the frogs would be hopping across the property and would fall into the hole. And then we'd go and check out how many frogs were there and what kind they were. And so that was kind of fun. We used to hear the whippoorwill more frequently. I heard it in the spring a little bit this year, but not as much and dependably as years ago. And but I just also wanted to mention that there's some things that we didn't have 60 years ago that we do have now. We have eagles on the lake now. We have geese. We have a lot more beavers, and that's a shame because they tear down the wood pile and take away our wood. We have no-see-ums now, and we didn't have no-see-ums before. And we still have a bat or two, but sure not as many bats as we used to have. As soon as the light started going out at nighttime, the bats started appearing, and they were plentiful before, but not so now. So there are changes, but there are things coming in that weren't there before. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Deborah, would you like to go now? There. Can you see that? I've asked you. Okay.
I think I've unmuted. Have I unmuted?
I think so. Go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deborah Doherty, new member, and I actually grew up in Southern Ontario in the Haldimand, Norfolk area. And when Linn came out with this message, I thought, you know, I wanted to expand a little bit on expanding our potential as well as my memories. So the memory I'm going to share with you today is a memory of the Linn Valley Trail. I grew up in a house that was 200 years old on an 8 acreage just outside of Simcoe, Ontario. And my father was a naturalist as well as an outdoor educator. And one of the things that he did was he got a summer grant for young people to create a trail through the Linn Valley. And because nature wasn't super accessible to the general public, we're talking sort of early 70s. And we didn't have the accessibility that, you know, people in England have of tramping through farmers' fields and things. So he got this grant, and one of the big things I do remember is actually we had a stile in the back of our property that allowed us to walk over into the neighbor's cornfield and then walk through and along the railroad trails and eventually get to town 4 kilometers away. And, you know, we would do a Christmas bird count there. And so as an individual, I had access to nature, and through that project, more people in our community had access to the fields. And then that project grew. The railroad was disbanded, and then it became a Rails to Trail project. And then you could go from Simcoe to Port Dover and walk and go through on your bike. And what was interesting for me was as the accessibility to nature grew, also people's awareness of nature grew and their protection of nature. And I can remember, you know, my dad was really big on putting up bluebird boxes, and I never saw a bluebird. And then when he died 8 years ago, we walked on the Linn Valley Trail and I saw a bluebird. And so for me, my memories, in fact, I actually see more diverse birds now than I did growing up in Southern Ontario. And I mean, he was a naturalist. We did Christmas bird counts. We lived very close to Port Rowan and Birds Canada. But and I don't discount what Lynn said at the beginning. Absolutely, we're losing populations and species dramatically. But I think some of that that accessibility to nature is allowing the next generation to treasure it. And I work with Safe Wings, which is why I am part of Ottawa Field Naturalists. And one of the big things that I want to do is preserve more birds for the next generations. And I certainly do when I go for my walks in the woods, don't hear the numbers of birds that I used to hear. And the bird songs is what I really miss, is hearing the variety of bird songs. But I'm hopeful that with the more accessibility and the next generation will carry on and enjoy nature as much as we do, and help us all to preserve it.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. Okay, let's see. Oh, I have the second story to say, so I'll do that now. No, I won't. I'll save that till later. Oh no, I'll go for it with my second story now. Coming back to that busy road that we still live on near Castleman. In the 90s, I had to come home once a week from a choir practice at night, 10 o'clock at night. And I came to dread doing that trip on a rainy fall night. Foggy, maybe a little bit warmer than it had been in the last few nights, because the road was covered with frogs and toads. And, a lot of them were dead. And I had to try and make my way down this highway and try to avoid frogs and toads. That was impossible. But there were so many of them. Every spring we had loud choruses of wood frogs and American toads, spring peepers from, all directions around our house. It was an agricultural area, but nevertheless, we're hearing all these frog noises. And that has really changed. We still can hear a few frogs in the spring. I don't think I heard a single toad this spring. This is from my door. Haven't had any more of those nights of driving in the rain and seeing frogs and toads all over the road. That is gone. Okay, so now let's, would anyone else now like to share a story of some kind? Share a memory? Now is when you should just raise your hand. If you can press that raise your hand button. I see Robert, you have a thumbs up thing there. Is that your raised hand? Okay. Robert, would you like, I'm just going to find you and try to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself now?
Yes.
Good.
Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
So I'd like to start with a question for Lynn. Lynn, how many people are on right now? What I'm seeing is 7 of us.
I don't,
15.
15 people online.
Okay. So before I tell you my story, I would just like to mention something that I've been thinking about for the club for quite a while, and is very closely related to what we're doing here tonight. But it would be to see if we could bring in a psychologist, a professional psychologist, who could maybe give us some tips on how to deal with all the bad news that we're getting in nature. So I actually know a university professor from the University of Ottawa who did a shout out recently to her colleagues looking for somebody who might be able to do that. She doesn't feel that she's qualified enough to do that. But before I go any further with it, it would be nice if I got a little bit of feedback from people as to whether they think it would be a good idea or whether they would think it would be a bad idea. And basically it's suggestions on how to cope with the bad news that we get regarding nature.
I'm wondering how to help.
So I see
people
that E.O. Driscoll has put her thumb up. Can you see that, Lynn?
Yes, I do. I'm not, do we all know how to do that? I'm not sure I know how to do that.
If you just go to reactions, you can choose either a thumb up or a yes or a no.
There's a raise hand.
No, not raise hand. Raise hand is different.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. All right. You're getting some reactions, Rob. I can't. Okay, I better just tell you what I think about it. I would be interested. I think about this too. So I'm sorry, I can't find the reaction though.
Okay. Why don't we just maybe do a raise of hand of the people who think it's a good idea, and then we'll go like this for the people who think it's a bad idea. Can we do that starting now?
Someone's got her hand.
So Rob, I'm seeing 8 thumbs up.
Okay, great.
I'm seeing 9 thumbs up. 10.
Are you seeing any thumbs down?
No.
Okay, so I think that settles it. I'll just go ahead and work with this professor and see if she can come up with somebody.
Okay.
Now, the story I wanted to tell you about was when I grew up in Greece, because I was born in Montreal, but I grew up in Greece from the ages of 10 to 17. And we lived outside the city. And if I walked to school along the main road, that would be the shortest way. But sometimes that would take me 15 minutes. But what I would do sometimes would be leave a little bit early, maybe 25 minutes, give myself 25 or 30 minutes and walk the back way, which would go through some hills. And that's when I started to, at the age of 10, start coming up on my own with an appreciation of nature. I would see, for example, tortoises. I would hear them knocking shell as males would be chasing females and then not knocking against them. There was a place not far from school where there was a gully, and so it's like a cliff with a stream at the bottom, the stream going very slowly. And in the cliff, there was a colony of jackdaws, which are a kind of a crow. And at that age, at the age of 11, 12, 13, I forget exactly how old I was, I had a pellet gun. And so I was trying to shoot things. I was shooting dead things or things that were inanimate. And I was also shooting live animals, including birds. And this went on for about a year or two until finally, I just kind of decided that I didn't want to be doing that anymore. And but in terms of the changes that have happened, that gully is no longer there. There's a road that is there. The cliff is no longer there, and it's overgrown, or it is partly there and it's overgrown. And I used to see frog eggs in a pond, and that pond eventually disappeared. I mean, I'm talking about, I was in Greece from 69 to 76. And so there were some pretty major changes, which you would expect on the outskirts of a city. And so I saw a lot of changes there. But on the other hand, every year we'd go up to Mount Olympus. We'd make a school trip and we'd go up to Mount Olympus. And it's now protected as a national park. And the reason why it was protected until it became a national park was because there is a monastery there. And monastery, I think the grounds, the areas surrounding monasteries are sacred, as far as I understand. And so it's very nice to go back to Mount Olympus and see that nothing has changed, whereas the places close to home that I was describing earlier have changed quite a bit. That's my story.
Thank you, Rob. Would anyone else like to put up their hand or put up their thumb? E. O'Driscoll, hello. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay. I didn't prepare anything, but just while I was sitting here, I thought I might mention, I grew up in Ottawa. I lived on Sunnyside Avenue down near the Rideau River. And when I was a kid, this was before the city of Ottawa had raised the banks of the Rideau. The Rideau used to flood big time. If you think you've seen floods, the Rideau River around Billings Bridge or down Brantwood, Cummings Bridge, that's nothing compared to what it used to be. Parks like the Windsor Park that was close to our house was a little bit lower than the banks, and it was filling up with water, and huge fish I didn't even know looked like whales to me, got caught in the pools as the water receded too. And before they raised the banks, there used to be frogs like mad. I mean, it was just deafening, the frogs that you could see when you're in the daytime, or you could hear at night croaking. So things have changed a lot along the Rideau River there. It actually used to be a place called Brighton Beach where we used to swim as kids in the Rideau River there, but that stopped after I left high school, I guess. I'm sorry if you hear my budgies chirping, I can't shut them up. The more I talk, the louder they talk. So I might end up shrieking at you. So anyway, yeah, and the other thing I might mention is that the family has a cottage in Muskoka, and you'll hear from people who drive a lot these days that, you know, you just don't get the bugs stuck in your radiator and so on anymore. And that's very true. I mean, last year when I went back to the cottage, it's just north of Huntsville, the car was pretty clean by the time I got there. And not only that, but usually when we drive in the road, you know, you put your long sleeves on and your trousers on, because the minute you get out of the car, you're attacked with bugs. But that's not as big a problem as it used to be. So the news is not that great, I would have to say. But yeah, it's, you know, when you think about it, things have changed an awful lot around everywhere. I guess everybody has a similar kind of story. So that's my end of it.
Thanks very much. What is your name? Your first name?
My first name, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, thank you. Be nice if we could all get to know each other a bit better. Okay, There are three people who, well, first of all, anybody else who wanted to share a story now? Louis. I've unmuted you, Louis, I hope.
Oh, yes, you have. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Yes, I'm Louis Larive. I've been living in Southeast Ottawa, specifically the Anvil Acres area for the past, it's almost 40 years now. And what I've noticed is sort of a change in, a small change in the bird population. In the 90s, it seemed to me that house finches were quite common in the area, whereas now I rarely ever see a house finch in the suburban area. But it's sort of, I don't know if it's if you call it niche replacement, but there's much more cardinals now in this area than there used to be. And I'm not sure exactly the reason for that. If there's competition between the species or not, but that's the general impression that I've had. That's the general thing I've noticed over the years. Yeah, so the changes probably happened somewhere in the 2000s, but I didn't pay close attention because I was raising a family at the time, and bird watching was sort of was the secondary thing during those years. So.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, three people sent me stories, all written out. So I'd like to read those to you. Oops, I think my paper's mixed up here. Okay, I have a story here from Carol Howard Donati. It's a recollection of hers about the St. Lawrence River at Lancaster near Cornwall. I'll read. I am originally from the West Coast and now live in Ottawa. I visited Ontario on a cross-country road trip in 1967 to see family and attend Expo in Montreal. I remember our stay with family in Lancaster and seeing eels in fresh water for the first time. We have eels, the wolf and the moray eel, off the coast in BC, but they're very different and actually not really eels at all, but that's another story. I was fascinated to see American eels in great abundance in the 1960s in the St. Lawrence River. I've lived in Ottawa now for 20 years, and I've never seen one. I believe the American eel was classified as endangered in 2007. Ottawa Riverkeeper released 400 eels into the Ottawa River at Petrie Island last summer in an effort to encourage the return of American eel stock to our area. So that was Carol Howard Donati. Now I have this story from Sherry Nigro, N-I-G-R-O. I'm not able to attend tonight, but I love the idea of sharing changes we've personally observed in nature over time. Here are a couple from my childhood. My observation is that there is an ebb and flow to nature, even to the range where animals live. I grew up in East Central Saskatchewan on a small mixed farm that is boreal forest, but close to the prairie. We always had lots of deer, moose, bear, beaver, mink, and muskrats around. I vividly remember my dad calling the kids out to a haystack one afternoon where a raccoon's tail hung out from a gap in the bales. How cool, as this was not a critter that we had seen before, coming to visit our pasture. Fast forward 45 years, and raccoons are a bit of a problem as they raid gardens. Other animals, like fishers, have now become inhabitants of that area. Again, these were unheard of while I was growing up. And animals like moose that traditionally stayed in the boreal forest are now frequently roaming prairie fields in the far south of Saskatchewan. It's too simplistic to say it's climate change, as some of these critters move south and some north. I can't think that it's related to human populations, as that area remains lightly populated. And while much land has been open for farming, there's still a lot of bush. I don't have the answers, but I find it interesting how the range of the animal has evolved over time in my lifetime. Okay. And now a third story. This one's from Anne Marie Johnson. And again, I'll just read what she wrote. I grew up in Manotick beside the Rideau and next to a creek that fed Mahogany Harbor, so named by my father. One of my favorite stories is one that Dad always used to tease my mother. In the late spring of 1962, we just moved into a little converted cottage in the country from Searville, a neighborhood in the big city of Ottawa. Dad had grown up in rural Ontario around Lake Simcoe, but Mom was a prairie girl and had never seen, let alone lived, near water. She had always been fascinated by stories of the great inland seas in eastern Canada, but knew nothing of what it meant to live close to water and could barely swim. Nonetheless, when she and Dad met and married near Lake Nipissing and then set up house in Ottawa, it was always considered temporary. Their real home would be as close to water as possible, and this was day one of a dream realized. The air was warm, and our family was all snuggled early in bed. The windows must have been open because Dad said Mom woke up suddenly, which was unusual since she could normally sleep through a train whistle, and sat straight up as a board in bed. Then she anxiously shook Dad awake. John, 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 wake up! There are cows, lots of them in the backyard. Dad woke up, listened quietly, and began to chuckle. Joan, those are bullfrogs, dear, not cows. Go back to sleep. I remember the mad symphony of lovelorn amphibians croaking, pick me, every night. It was soothing, sleep-inducing music as the bullfrogs played bass against the high notes of peepers and smaller frogs. The bullfrogs became a favorite background noise in our home and for every summer backyard neighborhood gathering. One summer in the early 1970s, neighbors we knew from Long Island came by canoe into the creek next door, captured a boatload of frogs, and took them home for a family cookout of frog legs. When we heard about the senseless carnage, all my neighbors and our household were outraged. I don't recall any legal consequences, but many friendships chilled from that day onward. I remember the deathly quiet of the nights that followed, and realizing years later that the soundscape never returned to its previous volumes. It was 2 years before we even heard a single bullfrog nearby again. The contrast between the rich noise before the harvest and the extreme quiet afterwards made me appreciate frogs of all kinds at an early age. My kids grew up fascinated by frogs too, but I've noticed during the course of my life that our soundscapes have changed dramatically thanks to climate change, habitat reduction, and competition from harsh sounds not found in nature, like traffic. When I do happen upon a good population of bullfrogs, the sound is even more fascinating for its rarity. Now I too will sit up straight, just as my mom once did, whenever I hear a bullfrog. It's such a wonderful sound, it must be savored. So that was Anne Marie Johnson. Would anyone like to tell a story or share a memory? Elizabeth? Let's see if,
Okay, this isn't really a memory, but I just thought I'd mention it. I'm reading a book that was written by George Catlin in the 1830s. It's not an easy read because the English style is fairly old, obviously. But what's astounding in these, it's a 2-volume book where he was an American who explored the American Midwest. Actually, he went from north of Florida up as far north as Sault Ste. Marie, recording and painting the North American indigenous people and the landscapes. And he canoed most of the ways, but he often went if there was like a steamboat available to take him down the Missouri or the Mississippi. And he mentions seeing as far as the eye can see the bison herds. And he would mention that the steamboat sound, the sound of the steamboat would make the clouds of elk and deer and all that start moving off and skipping around and so on. And he talks about some of the wild horses that the horses were introduced by the Spaniards earlier and became like the Mustangs that we know today, sort of thing. So it's really astounding to read the description of just how many animals there were and how they started off not being afraid of humans, but that changed quickly. So it's quite an interesting book if you can plow through it, but it's interesting and it's horrifying. So I just thought I'd mention that. It's a very old book, but my goodness, I mean, the landscape was certainly different. He talks about St. Louis, for example, and some of these towns that we know that are huge and full of people now. And he talks about all the green spaces and it's verdant and the way he describes it. So it's just, I guess he probably paddled through Eden without knowing it. So anyway.
thank you. Barbara, I think you put your hand up, didn't you? I'll try to find you here and ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Lynn. My recollections go back to Southwest Ontario, Windsor. I grew up at Windsor and towns in that area. And I remember this goes back to the 50s. And there's 3 separate things I'd like to mention. One of them is that my recollection of driving down the highways and country roads at that time, all along there were ditches, and the ditches were full of daylilies. We called them tiger lilies. I don't know if they were actually formally tiger lilies, but that's what they were. And they were in profusion every summer. You saw them along the roadways everywhere, as well as Queen Anne's lace. Those are the 2 plants I remember. And I've gone back to that area, to visit family and so on over the decades. And of course, the ditches are all gone because the roads have been widened and sewer pipes have been put in and so on. And so, and the wildflowers have basically disappeared. I mean, you drive along the road and you don't see that anymore. There may be others there, but not that profusion of daylilies and Queen Anne's lace that I remember. The second thing I'd like to mention is something called the Mayfly. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. We called them June bugs, but when I was a kid, but that was a mistaken thing. If you look up a Mayfly, it's a delicate little insect with very large wings. They live about a day, I think, and that's all. And they're associated with water. I don't know enough about their life cycle, but at some point it takes place in the water. So down near the very bottom of Essex County, which runs right along Lake Erie, that they were particularly bad. I mean, they were bad all throughout the county, bad in the sense that there were hordes of them, absolutely hordes. These started in late June and ran into July. And in the towns that were right on the lake, like Leamington, Kingsville, and even Harrow, which was inland a bit, at the height of the Mayfly season, you had to drive very carefully because if you brake, the car would swerve. The roads were littered with the bodies of these insects. And I remember going, one of my jobs was, we had a cottage right down in Lake Erie. In the mayfly season, getting up and getting a broom and sweeping down the walls of the cottage, because they would be covered in hundreds and thousands of mayflies. The cars would be covered in mayflies. You had to sweep them off. And in the lakeside towns, they enclosed these streetlights in some kind of dark red cloth, I suppose. I don't think it was paper. So they would attract fewer mayflies, because it was a lethal issue, because they were all over the streets, and their bodies were just made the streets very greasy and unsafe. I don't know when the mayflies died out in that area, in the clouds and clouds and clouds that came. But I think it was sometime in the 60s probably. And if they're there anymore, they are in such tiny numbers that nobody notices them anymore. They don't exist. I don't know if they've moved, disappeared entirely from Lake Erie or what. And the third story has to do with Jack Miner. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He was an early conservationist, and he established a feeding station for Canada geese in 1904. This was one of the very earliest conservation efforts, as far as I know, in Ontario and maybe in the country, I don't know. And he decided that he would try, and I don't know if they were threatened, if the Canada geese were threatened at that point in terms of their survival, but I gather they were something of a rarity. At least he felt they needed support. And so for 4 years, he spread food, grain, and whatever out on some of his fields. And the second year, geese started to arrive. And certainly everybody in that area knew all about Jack Miner. I mean, he was regarded as sort of he was a local hero, really. And he started banding birds in about, I think, 1909. He was one of the first people to band birds and track where they went. And as a result of the results of that banding that he did himself, he and his family, it was part of what led to the establishment of the U.S. Canadian Migratory Bird Convention in, I think, 1916 or something like that. And it's still, Jack Miner's the place. I mean, it's become a museum, and it still attracts Canada geese. I don't know that they're in need of help as much now as they were then. I remember visiting as a child, and of course this would be true anywhere they are, and you went at dusk and there'd be nothing on the fields, and then you'd see these flights coming in. And I suppose we could see that in Ottawa if you were in the right place as well. It was a very miraculous occurrence for a child to come and watch these one flight would come in, then another would come in, then another and another and another. By the time it was dark, of course, that was it. They were all in for the night. Anyway, those are just remembrances I have from Essex County in the 1950s, and massive changes, of course, in the roadside flowers and the mayfly, which may have disappeared, but Jack Miner's continues.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Those are very vivid stories. Is anybody else? I'm gonna see. Has anybody else got something they'd like to say? Or a story they would like to tell, really? Elizabeth, I'm gonna ask you to unmute. Elizabeth.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Elizabeth Robson Gordon. Hi, everyone. I'm going to stay off camera because I am tired and lying down. So I have been alive for less than 30 years, so my time scale is pretty short, but then also that I notice changes is also significant. So I spent my formative nature-loving years on Georgian Bay. That's Owen Sound. So that'd be from 2000 till 2008, 2009. And that's where, I was at the age where I was really getting into nature and forming these memories. So we're thinking about things changing, and I'm thinking more about like landscape changing. So we go through to Toronto fairly often. It was less than 3 hours away. And the amount of so-called development, and the amount of green space and farmland and whatever that disappeared just within those 8 years is astounding. Like, we probably would go there earlier because I had grandparents there, so we would have driven the same areas even younger, but I still would have been pretty little. But the amount just within my lifetime of what used to be nature and is no longer nature. I remember there was this one office tower that we'd always see, and that was the start of Toronto. And now the start of Toronto is much further out. Another thing I want to mention is Great Lakes. So because I've lived in different parts of Ontario and been at different ages, I can't trust my memory around how much snow is a normal winter snow, because a normal winter on Georgian Bay is very different than a normal winter in Ottawa, regardless if it's my childhood memories are different than my more grown-up memories. But what I do remember is the water level of Georgian Bay significantly changing within the time I was there. As I said, I would have visited a little bit younger because grandparents there and go to the beach, but there's like the rock that we'd swim out to and stand on. And it used to be, you know, the water would be lapping over the top of it, and we could just, you know, stand with just our ankles underwater and feel like we're standing on water. Wow, it's so cool. And then in the later years, you know, okay, it's poking above in the sunshine, you can sit on it, and then it's mostly out of the water. So that's just really interesting. The water level change and my understanding of the Great Lakes in the grand scheme of things. They're post-glacial, so they're eventually going to dry up in however many generations. They're just massive puddles that have been around for a couple thousand years and maybe will be around for however many more thousands, maybe of years. I don't know. But that they just don't have that source. And so that's my understanding. They had steps down to the beach, and my parents remember when the water would come right to the steps, and at my age there was, you know, a couple meters, and that meters, I don't know the exact distance that increased in the time I was there, but that definitely was a change. So that's nature notice, and not just organism notice, but the actual, yeah, the landscape, as some were mentioning. So that's what I have to share tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Would anybody else like to say a nature memory? Elizabeth, I'll unmute you.
I was just reminded of some of the photographs that we have of the family where they used to drive through Algonquin Park, and this was when my eldest siblings were young, and they have pictures of deer everywhere. The deer were coming to the road to be fed by hand, and there's all kinds of beautiful pictures of, well, I guess it's not good to feed the deer by hand, but I mean, it was fascinating for the little kids to do that. And Algonquin Park has changed a bit more. Back then, this would have been in the 50s or 60s sort of thing. And I think that at the time there was more logging in Algonquin Park. And so now it's a little bit more grown up, at least near Highway 60 where the tourists go through. So you don't see as many deer there. But it was just astounding to see all the deer and how tame they were. Probably not good for, that was in the olden days sort of thing, in the sense that the highway wasn't as well developed, right? So there wasn't that many people driving at high speed, but yeah, lots of tourists then.
Thank you. So at this time, if there aren't any more stories, are there any more stories? Any memories that people would like to bring up? Then if there's anything else, at this point, I haven't been keeping track of the chat. I know there's been a little bit of conversation about a book, maybe other things too. But if anybody would like to make any comments or ask one of the other people on the call something about their story, please go ahead. Just let me know if you'd like to speak. Okay, Barbara, I'm going to unmute you.
I noticed there was a question about what the mayflies ate. I don't think they ate anything once they hatched as flies, or some earlier in their transformation as in, I don't know what stage they would have had nourishment of some kind. I don't know anything about their life cycle really. I just remember the results of these clouds of insects, but I'm sure the information obviously would be on Google somewhere. But they certainly, once they'd hatched as insects, they didn't eat. They just, that was it. They had a day's existence, and that was the end of it. That's. I only knew the last chapter of their lives.
Okay. And Elizabeth Robson Gordon, have I muted you?
Yeah, just a note about people talk about books and records, and I just find it's really important to remember these things because, you know, if we're only going off, if I'm only going off my memory, that's missing a lot of things. But also, my husband found this book. It's Diary of a Country English Lady or something like that. So it's some woman in 1908, I believe. And almost every day she'd write about the weather or what she saw, and then she'd do sketches. And it is such a delight to read. We'd follow along throughout the year, this past year. And it's just really pleasing to see somebody, you know, oh, I'm noticing the birds, I'm noticing this. And it's just really, it's delightful, but it's also really important for science to have this information. You know, now there's kind of a data overload, and the problem is trying to find it, but it's trying to find the pattern in it. But it's also really great to have long historical records. I was listening to a radio program and it was talking about a temple in Japan that would always record the first snowfall. And the article is a problem because they haven't had snow in 3 out of the past 10 years, but this idea that you have centuries worth of weather records. So whether it's for science to have an accurate baseline of what's real because our memories are short, or if it's just because it'll make a really lovely read for somebody in the next century, which I hope people are reading my diary in the next century. But I think back then when there wasn't Twitter where you told everyone what you had for breakfast, people wrote their diaries possibly differently because they had the understanding relatives would probably go through them eventually. But it's just really nice to have that information, those stories. It's nice to know that throughout time people have noticed things as we notice things. And as somebody else was talking about education, my studies were environmental science, but my thesis project was about bias, but this idea that a lot of the reading I did was about how people might notice some things and not other things. So, you know, there's lots of birders. People get really into nature and really into birding, though not everyone knows plants. Now, I also am very bad at identification, but the concept was this around if you don't recognize things, you don't care. And as someone was talking about trails, you know, once you spend time there, once you're, you know, walking and you see something at the side of the road and say, oh, that's the daylily or the Queen Anne's lace, and it's kind of like recognizing a friend, then you care more when you're able to recognize. So just the access to nature, which Ottawa is great for, but also the appreciation for nature. It's just, yeah, it's good that people are still caring. It just, yeah, that's all I'm thinking about. It's good that people still care. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, geez. Somebody, oh, I know, Deborah, you've got your hand up. I've asked you to unmute.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to there were a couple of things that triggered a couple of memories for me. And I grew up, I remember visiting Jack Miner Conservation Area as well, because I was a little bit further east on Lake Erie. But one of the things I remember, and it sort of ties in with what Elizabeth was just saying about sharing those memories, was seeing the trumpeter swans come through and near Long Point. And I remember about 10 years ago, I took my son to the same spot and the trumpeter swans were there. So just passing those memories on, and sharing those memories. And then kind of a funny one that I wanted to share with you, because we've been a lot of talk about frogs and tadpoles and things tonight. And when we our first home in Ottawa was in Orleans, close to Patriot Island, just around where the 10th line extension is now. And so we backed onto the Ottawa River and the swamp and had lots of mosquitoes. And then they were put in the big sewer line. And I was just devastated that our woods was being torn apart. But instead of being devastated, I took the kids down with buckets and we rescued tadpoles, and they still remember that. And we took them down and dumped them in the river. And that sewer line is now a cross-country ski trail and a bike trail. So it's actually has turned out to be not a bad thing after all, and in terms of accessibility. But it was just it's a funny little family memory of rescuing tadpoles and preservation. And I think, if we can pass that forward and get people to appreciate and identify, and that's one of the ways that we'll all help with that. Just the one little ripple, and that we all can do, and it will help us feel better about climate change.
Thanks, Deborah. Sharon, I just caught a glimpse of your, that you're having trouble with your connection. I've just asked you to unmute. I don't know if you can see that.
I'm like Elizabeth RG. I'm going to keep my video off because my connection is quite unstable. But I put something in the chat. Elizabeth had been talking about baselines and the connection for data. Just to let you know, I'm with 2 stewardship groups. We have just had an ecological study done of Hampton Forest and the Carlington Forest, so the Clyde Woods, Carlington Woods area. So we now have data going back to 1977 for those 2 areas. That's going to be coming available. But my God, all these great memories are bringing up my own. Hampton Park is the place I know the best. I've been on this planet for 54 years, and I've been within walking distance of that park for that entire time. So I have seen way too many horrible changes. But I want to kind of end on a more positive note. I would like to leave a happier memory. One thing I do remember not seeing as much of when I was a kid, and you can't go to the park now and not see them, is woodpeckers. Because we have so much deadfall. So they're doing us a favor. At the very least, they're keeping our bugs under control. And I'm seeing more dragonflies. And unfortunately, that is we used to have frogs in the creek, and maybe there's not as many snakes either. So maybe the dragonflies are being able to hang in there. And in Carlington, I'm lucky enough to see foxes almost every week. I can be guaranteed to see a fox. And you know, I see the changes and I get devastated by it, but that's the way I deal with it. It's just like, I can't do anything about the past, and I can't do anything about the people who don't see it yet, except have those conversations with them. And it's one conversation at a time. So I have to focus on the things that I see every day. So, you know, the other day when I went out and I saw two foxes in the city snow dump in the city yard, you know, and it's just like, wow. And I'm in the middle of a city. I'm a city kid. And that was my wilderness growing up, and it remains it to this day. So thank
Life
you.
in the wilderness.
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you. I'm looking if anybody else would like to say anything. Okay then. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this evening. We had a variety of stories. It was very nice to see you all, and I hope sometime we can actually meet in person, like this year. I really do hope that somebody said it just in the last 10 minutes, how important these memories are. I value them, and we should share them. I guess that's it for now. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.